Thank you guys for all being here. It's such a beautiful day, and I would definitely be outside running or biking. I would not be swimming, sorry Jim. But really, thanks everyone for being here. A little bit about my background. I grew up playing soccer, hockey, and baseball, and the only real reason that I ran was to get in shape for soccer season. Similar story to Jim, it would just be out the door, run as fast as I could for the 2-mile test that I had coming up in the fall. And there was really no thought into zones or anything along those lines. When I stopped playing hockey, that's where triathlon and getting into running became a little bit more of a part of my life. But the same things happened, just going out, running as hard as I could for as long as I could, and ran into some issues with shin splints and things along those lines. So about 2 years ago or so, I started working with Jim, so I can attest that the Zone 2 training, although it seems crazy, it does work. Because it's worked for me personally. So tonight we're going to talk about strength training for runners, and I'm hoping that this is a very easy, digestible overview of this topic, and we'll kind of jump right into it. So these are my two main running buddies. One of them's here tonight. The other one would have benefited from Jim's talk because she has one speed and it's really, really fast. So after about 2 miles, she's absolutely toasted. So really the objectives for tonight, we want to gain a better understanding of what the current strength training principles are, and really look at the specific running demands and how they impact the human body, and introduce some run-specific strengthening exercises to send you guys home with tonight. We'll touch briefly on seasonality and how to prioritize strength training versus aerobic training or endurance training. And then the main goal is to answer the question, should runners, should we be incorporating strength training into our performance programming? And I think we all, just being here, have a little bit of an inclination to that, but as always, it is a it depends answer. So why strength training? From an endurance perspective, we know that strength training improves power, rate of force development, and speed production. And it does this by altering the muscle fiber type recruitment. And by building maximum strength of type 1 or those slow twitch muscle fibers. Strength training also changes the proportion of type 2A muscle fibers, which are more endurance based and less fatigue, or more resistant to fatigue. And it will decrease the prevalence of type 2X muscle fibers. We won't dive too much into the nitty gritty with that, but in general, it's going to help delay fatigue, improve power, strengthen the rate of force development. It decreases fat, it improves lean muscle mass. And one of the big things is it reduces sarcopenia, or the age-related loss of muscle. It improves bone and tendon health. And we'd like to say that it reduces injury risk, but unfortunately the research is a little all over the place when it comes to this, looking at runners specifically. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. All those things though, just from a running perspective, sound pretty good, right? If we can delay the onset of fatigue, improve our overall speed, force production, those things seem like they would be beneficial building into our running program. In general, the research kind of supports this improvement in running economy, and so we'll dive into that a little bit deeper in the next few slides. So, age-related muscle mass, or the loss of muscle. Who here is over the age of 30? A few. So really, once we hit the age of 30, we start to lose about 3 to 8% of our muscle mass per decade. By the time we hit 60 to 75, we lose up to 15% of our muscle mass per decade at that point of our lives. And so not just resistance training, exercise and aerobic training as well, help stunt essentially the loss of muscle moving forward. I love this picture. This is a study that looks at master's level athletes, so triathletes, cyclists, runners, and swimmers. And we can see down here we have a 70-year-old master's level athlete, so participating in exercise 4 to 5 days a week. And then we have a sedentary 74-year-old. And just looking at the amount of adipose tissue versus the muscle mass. And so what we know is that with resistance training, we're able to increase muscle mass, strength, and improve function. So there's a lot of research out about fall risk in the elderly, and we know that by improving strength and all these things, it helps reduce those ill consequences down the road. Resistance training is really the first line of defense when it comes to losing muscle mass. But aerobic training does very well with that as well, as we can see from this picture here. So bone health, and I think this is something that for me, my conception has always been, don't runners already have good bone health? And when we compare it to people that are walking or hiking, yes, running has a stimulus with a ground reaction force that's going to help stimulate bone health compared to those individuals. But what we do know is that after about 20 repetitive loading cycles, our bone cells actually become bored with running and they stop responding. So they stop actually laying down more bone. And what we see is that runners, especially compared to individuals that have done these multiplanar sports growing up, they actually have lower bone mineral density. Some of that's just because of this repetitive single planar loading that occurs during running, but some of that's also due to energy deficiency. So I'm sure a lot of us here have heard about like the female athlete triad, the male athlete triad, or red S. And basically what that is we're not taking enough energy in to participate at the level that we need to, or at the number of calories that we're burning with exercise. And so that has serious implications not only from a bone health perspective, but also looking at the prevalence of stress reactions and bony stress injuries in these athletes as well. A few of these, going through the research, early sport specialization. So this isn't just unique to runners, but runners, cyclists, and swimmers. Basically, if those individuals were participating in those sports for more than 9 months out of the year and not participating in other sports, they were more likely to have lower bone mineral density than individuals who participated in at least one other sport over the course of the year. What we know is that participation in ball sports, so soccer, basketball, ice hockey counts in that, that actually, the multiplanar loading, our bones don't get bored from that, essentially. And so we're able to build significantly more bone mineral density. And that has some implications as we're thinking about strength training of loading our joints and our bones in different ways than what running gives us, but also thinking about the speed at which we're loading. So potentially bringing some plyometrics and things along those lines into the mix. So from a bone health perspective, the research is fairly robust here. This first study here by Duplanty et al., they had adolescent cross-country runners, and they had one group that ran with strength training, one group that just ran, and then a control group that didn't participate in either. There was no differences from a biomarker standpoint on bony health, but the individuals that participated in resistance training had a significant increase in bone mineral density versus the other two groups. Female cadets going into boot camp that had less than 7 months of formal resistance training were found to have a significantly higher risk of bony stress injuries compared to those that were habitual strength trainers, essentially. So then, thinking about tendon health. Tendons are essentially, they're made to accept and transmit force. And we know that with strength, with running in particular, there's high incidences of tendinopathy. With Achilles tendinopathy, anyone here deal with that in the past? I'm not alone, thanks Ruth. Patellar tendinopathy, both being highly prevalent with runners. What we know is that resistance training improves the load capacity or the resiliency of those tendons. That has significant implications not only from an injury prevention standpoint, but from a force development and an athletic performance standpoint. If we want to get into the nitty-gritty of it, basically strength training improves tendon stiffness, or that musculotendinous junction stiffness, and improves our force production as a result of that. It also increases the collagen fibril synthesis and increases the density of collagen fibers in our tendons. Essentially, we get a more robust, resilient tendon that we'd like to think is less prone to injury down the road. So, running economy, is basically, the definition of it is the steady state oxygen consumption at a given submaximal running speed. So essentially, the better your running economy, the less oxygen you utilize at that same speed. This is a really multifactorial concept, and so we have to think of anthropometric factors such as height, limb length, body mass index. We have some modifiable factors, so looking at our stride length, cadence, lower limb alignment with running. Footwear falls into that as well. And then we have these neuromuscular properties. So looking at our reactive strength, or how well we're able to produce a forceful concentric contraction, so a shortening contraction, after we've landed in an eccentric contraction. And so with running, that's basically what we're doing over and over again. As we're landing, we're going into an eccentric contraction at our calf, and then we're having to propel off quickly in a concentric way over and over and over again. And so we know that strength training can help with that reactive strength. And as we talked about before, it can improve leg muscle stiffness. So with heightened stiffness, what happens is we have decreased deformation of that musculotendinous unit. That decreases the required muscle activation that we need. And as a result, it reduces our energy expenditure. So we have that neuromuscular property bubble that obviously strength training helps with, but it also can help with those anthropometric factors like BMI. As we talked about before, if we can lose fat and increase lean muscle mass. And then with those modifiable factors. So looking at our lower limb kinematics, running in general is a repeated sagittal plane motion where we're going to be bounding from one leg to the next. But if we're weak with our lateral musculature or core musculature, we're very inefficient at moving forward, and we can get hip drop, knee can drive in, all those sorts of things, right? So if we're not strong in those lateral or frontal planes, we lose a lot of our efficiency moving forward. So really, strength training theoretically can help with all three of these categories. Now, there's a lot of research out there that supports the introduction of strength training for the improvements in running economy, but there's some out there that doesn't really show a positive impact from one group to the other. So we can't necessarily say that for sure it does improve running economy. There's no studies out there, though, that say that has a negative impact on running economy that I can find, at least. So I think from a strength training perspective, we would like to think that this helps improve running economy as well. So looking at running a little bit more specifically and the demands on the human body, Chris Johnson, who's kind of like the PT guru when it comes to running, he defines running as a combination of rhythm, timing, coordination, tissue capacity, and load tolerance. A pretty nerdy way to think about it, but it works. Running is really different from walking, is that it's defined as a one or none activity. So where you have a float phase, like this guy is here with both feet off the ground, and then we have a single limb stance phase. And like we talked about before, it's a repetitive sagittal plane motion, so we're basically doing a single leg squat or a single leg bound over and over and over again, but that requires a huge amount of lateral plane stability. And speed will impact that ground reaction force and our muscle activation. So if we're running slower versus faster, that can have implications on how much our body has to respond to that. So this is a very brief overview of this, but this article came out in 2012 by Dorn. And basically it looked at how much our muscles have to react during stance and swing phase. And at the ankle during our stance phase, the gastroc-soleus complex, or calf complex, takes up to 8 times our body weight during that stance phase. Our quad at our knee takes up to 4 to 5 times our body weight. During the swing phase, our hip musculature becomes a little bit more involved, particularly at higher speeds. So hamstring acting as a hip extensor, and then hip flexors can take up to 8 to 9 times our body weight during the swing phase, okay? So that's just something to kind of jog your thoughts on. When we're thinking about resistance training, we want to be not necessarily trying to go 3 or 4 times our body weight, but we also want to be pushing beyond our own body weight and not just doing body weight exercises when we're looking at making true adaptation with strength training. This table over here, in PT school we learned you should be able to do 25 single leg heel raises, and that is now kind of been thrown into the wind. And so this table, and I'll encourage you guys to go home and try this tonight, If you're in your 30s, as a male, you have to be doing 32 single leg heel raises, and as a female, 27. Now the caveat with this is a little bit more running specific, is that we're actually on a 10-degree decline, or incline, I guess, and we're going to a specific metronome. This is really hard, and especially if someone has an injury history like Achilles tendinopathy or something along those lines, we want to see that people kind of hit these benchmarks, and that would be, in our mind, kind of complete rehabilitation, and starting to think about the implications for programming strengthening as a result of that. All right, so strength training principles. We really have to consider what's the underlying goal here. For most of us, it's run faster, run more efficiently, and not get hurt, right? But everyone's going to have their own unique goals, and I think that's where working with a personal trainer, a coach, a physical therapist, to be able to take into account your training history. How much do we want to prioritize strength training over aerobic training for each individual? But then also looking into the injury history. Do they have a history of Achilles tendinitis? Do we need to continue to push the envelope from that perspective? Or have they been injury-free for their career? We also have to consider, have they ever strength trained before? How much motor learning do we have to instill in these people to get form down so that they're not going to hurt themselves in the gym and then not be able to run as a result of that? And then we want to be really specific when it comes to running. So I've had so many people that come in and they've done physical therapy, and what their exercises were clamshells on their side, right? And that doesn't necessarily replicate the demands of running that we just talked about, where our quad's taking 4 to 5 times our body weight. We want to be up on our feet, doing exercises that mimic running as best as possible. And that's where the single leg balance and neuromuscular control comes into play. We want to challenge ourselves in those run-specific positions, and that's how we want to kind of structure our strength training program. So this chart here kind of looks even deeper into, as we're strength training, what's the goal of it? Are we trying to improve power? Are we trying to improve strength, endurance, or are we trying to get big? And so all of this is kind of based off of 1 rep max, and we'll dive into this a little bit more specifically for runners. One thing I want you guys to notice here, though, is for the most part, if we're trying to lift from a strength perspective, there's about a 2-minute rest between sets here. And I think for most of us, we go to the gym and try to move really quickly through things and don't necessarily give adequate time for rest in between. But that's a really important thing when we're starting to think about this programming. So the minimal stimulus is overload. So for untrained individuals or people that haven't been doing a consistent gym routine, that's basically 60% of our 1 rep max, which is going to be hovering between 15 and 20 reps, maximum reps. Really, if we're looking at performance, we want to be loading at greater than 70% of our 1 rep max. So somewhere around that 10, 11, 12 rep range. Now, as people, again, as we're first learning those movements, we're going to have to adjust that. We're going to have to lower the weight to make sure that people are safely getting in and out of those positions, that they feel confident, and they're not so sore that they're not able to run for 3 days afterwards, because that doesn't do us any good either. This idea of RPE, or rated perceived exertion, is something that I really like to use. And so on this, basically 10 out of 10 is you could not possibly do 1 more rep. It was the hardest thing, you could not do 1 more. 5, which we would consider hard, right? You could maybe have 5 reps left in the tank, but it was still hard, it was challenging. And really, we want to be, for the most part, kind of hanging out in this 5 to 7 range as we're learning movements, and then starting to progress beyond that as we're becoming proficient in those movements down the road to get those tendinous adaptations that we're looking for. And so this is kind of a chart that looks at, as we're first starting to learn these movements, so people that are new to strength training or people that have taken a long hiatus or are looking to get back into it for the first time, we're thinking primarily off of RPE, so it should be hard to very hard by the end of their exercise, or by the end of the set. But we're looking at 8 to 12 reps. By that 12th rep, they should be saying, yeah, I'm working pretty hard. And as we go through 2 sets or 3 sets, we might see them not be able to get to 12. They might be stopping closer to 8, but that's a really appropriate place for them to be starting. As people become more comfortable getting into the gym and lifting heavier and able to find a balance between running and getting in a strength training program, we can start to up the load a little bit. So dropping the reps down, getting into a 5 to 7 rep range, and we want to see that 1 rep max or that perceived exertion go up a little bit. When we're thinking about maximum strength, those are really bilateral movements. And again, we just talked about we want to be doing a lot of single leg movements that are mimicking running. But those bilateral movements are super important from a force production standpoint, bony and tendon health standpoint as well. And so my programming through gym, we have a lot of programs, back squats, deadlifts, hip thrusters or glute thrusters, and we have some bench press stuff for swimming and things along those lines. But that's all programmed into the routine over the course of the year. And there's certain times of the year that we prioritize some types of strength, and other times of year that we'll prioritize the endurance-based strength. So, thinking about running specifically, again, we want to think about rehab versus performance. So when we're coming back from an injury, there are times where we have to shut people down for running. It's my least favorite thing to do. And if we can keep people running as much as possible through rehab, we're going to try to do that. Things like bony injuries and things like that, we do have to shut people down short term. But we have to kind of consider rehab versus performance. What are the demands on the human body with running, and are we replicating that when we're going into the weight room? So if we go back to that sideline clamshell example, we really want to be doing clamshells up on our feet, squatting, deadlifting, doing box jumps, things along those lines that have that explosiveness that we want to be able to dig deeply find our other gear as we're kind of like suffering at the end of a marathon, right? So the biggest thing here is we want to mimic run-specific demands. We want to have a combination of that eccentric, concentric, reactive strength. We want to have some single leg strength, and we want to build in some speed. So we can do that with a metronome to a specific running cadence. We can do that in a lot of different ways, and we can kind of touch on that. All right, so this is one of my favorite exercises, and I'll usually start people off with something like this. It's a runner's march. A lot of times I'll have people do this on the initial eval, and they're falling all over the place, yet they can go out and run 20 miles with no issue whatsoever. So this is a weighted march right now. Really looking for a nice upright posture. I'm holding about 2 kettlebells, about 70 pounds or so here. And as people become more comfortable with it, we can start to build in a little bit more weight. But we're getting on an upright posture, we're working on balance, control, that's what we're looking for. So this is a runner step down. This is another one of our favorites here, or step up and step down. So again, putting people in a single leg stance, making them struggle a little bit through the balance initially. We don't necessarily need to be going as low as I'm going here. We can keep our knee a little bit straighter to mimic running a little bit more. But this is, again, something that we can do to a metronome to replicate running cadence. And we can also add weight in as this starts to feel easy for individuals. So here's that runner's clamshell that we were talking about. So instead of doing a clamshell laying down, which sometimes that's the perfect answer, if we have to offload or we have to work on specific areas, that's fine. But as people are starting to build back into running, we want to try to mimic those demands as best we can. Breathing hard with this one. Thanks for the sound, Matt. But thinking about balance, control, staying upright, this is a really challenging exercise. You feel it in your stance leg as you're doing it pretty quickly. Goblet squats. Something for someone just starting out, a lot of high schoolers, getting them used to squatting with a little bit of weight. If people have more of a background, we can do a trap bar squat, we can do a front squat, back squat, and really load them up so they're getting to that point of fatigability. trap bar deadlift here. This could be something where we go slow and smooth, heavy, or we can add speed with this, right? So improving some of that plyometric strength as we're doing these sorts of things. Now, these next two are a little bit more specific for people that may have had an Achilles tendinopathy or something along those lines. So again, if we go back to that slide looking at single leg calf raises, we want to build up that calf capacity to mimic the demands of running. Again, calf takes up to 6 to 8 times our body weight during stance phase. So this could be something where if our athlete has a specific injury history, we might be sprinkling this in there with their performance running program. Not super exciting, but it gets the job done. And we can certainly add weight in with this in a variety of different ways. And then it gets a little bit more fun thinking about that reactive strength again. So once they have that baseline capacity, we can start to build in some reactive strength. And that would look something like a pogo, where we're getting that eccentric load and then being able to propel off the ground with that. Okay, so how do we break this up over the course of the season? And Jim, with his programming, he has strength training in the winter season as kind of a priority, right? So in the off season, the goal is to get strong. And so during that season, we want to kind of prioritize heavier loads, lower repetitions, and we can do this on our lower intensity days. So days that we're doing our long zone 2 runs, days that we're having some lower intensity tempo runs, or for me as a triathlete, days that I'm going into the pool. It just makes sense. I'm at the gym already, and that's the day that I'm going to do some of this. The way that we have it broken up, 2 to 3 days a week is kind of the sweet spot in the off season. But there's a fair amount of literature out there that says 2 days a week is adequate for endurance athletes to build up enough of the strength stimulus and get some of those physiological benefits. When we shift into the racing season, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. It depends if you're a high school athlete, the off season is the summer, and then we're in season, high school or college athlete, you might be in season for 9 months out of the year, right? And so, just like Jim was talking about from an aerobic standpoint, you can get better from an aerobic perspective for decades. The same is true from a strengthening standpoint. So if we have high schoolers or college athletes that are working really hard over the course of the summer to get stronger, and then they don't strength train for 9 months out of the year, a lot of those benefits are going to be lost over the course of the season. For master's level athletes, like us in this room, we might have an A race. So we might have had people that just ran Boston Marathon on Monday. We might have people gearing up for New York City Marathon in the fall. And we can start to tweak our programming a little bit in that 8 to 12 weeks before their A race. And again, the priority will shift a little bit more towards tempo runs, hill repeats. We can get some run-specific strength in, where we can start to shy away from some of this weight room strength training as well. Again, we want to be trying to get into the weight room 1 to 2 days a week during this, but the goal is to lose as little strength as possible. We're not trying to get strong, we're not trying to get big, we're just trying to lose as little strength as possible over the course of that quote-unquote taper, right? Again, on our low intensity days, that's the best time to be doing it. Our low intensity days, whether that's again a tempo run, a low level tempo run, or a zone 2 run, those would be the best times to do it. So, is resistance training the answer for everyone? So, runners need to run to be good at it, and I think Jim touched on that pretty well. And so, Yamaguchi came out with a study looking at runners. I believe it was the Tokyo Marathon, and monthly training volume was the most important predictor for marathon finishing time. So at the end of the day, you need to run. But if strength training can keep you healthy and help you run more, then that's a positive on that front. We have to think about the individual's training history and where they're coming to us at. When I started working with Jim, my aerobic base was smaller than was not good. The priority was zone 2 training, building up that aerobic base. Strength training was not the priority at that point. As the base has become bigger, now we can start to incorporate more strength training and become a stronger, more resilient athlete. And so it's a really individualized, and it's not the answer for everybody, but we have to look at the person, where they're coming from a training history perspective, to be able to make a good strength training program for that person. Then again, looking at their injury history. Should they, because of their injury history, should they be strength training more? Should they be strength training less? Should they be focusing on certain areas? Should they be avoiding certain areas? Age, right? So master's level athletes, if we're over 30 years old, we're going to be losing some muscle mass. The older we get, probably the more resistance training makes sense to help stunt some of those impacts. At the end of the day though, stress is stress is stress. And we have training stress from an aerobic perspective, we have work stress, we have family stress, we have financial stress. If the stress of building resistance training in, or whatever it may be, becomes too much on the body, then it's not necessarily worth it. We have to focus on things that are going to be the best bang for our buck, ultimately. Okay? Any questions?
I guess real quick, when you were talking resistance, does that refer to both like bands and weight as well? Just to make sure.
Yeah, it does. But I think one of the big things when we're thinking about resistance in the context of running is, if the bands aren't necessarily getting us to work hard in those specific rep set ranges, then they may not necessarily be an adequate resistance stimulus to make the physiological changes that we're looking for. But certainly, like with specific exercises, whether it's like the standing clam or lateral band walks, things along those lines, resistance bands certainly can fill that void. Anyone else?